Hello, it's Matt McLachlan. Before we get to this week's podcast, I wanted to extend a very special invitation to you. In August 2025, my signature tour is heading back to the Western Front, and I'd love you to come with me. We're going to explore the battlefields of France and Belgium and tell the entire story of the Australians during the First World War. It's going to be an amazing trip. We're going to visit the Somme, we're going to visit the Ypres Salient, French Flanders, famous battlefields such as Passchendaele, Pozières, Villers-Bretonneux, Bullecourt, Fromelles, and many more. Now, this is the only tour I'm going to personally escort to the Western Front in 2025. So if you'd like to come with me, please don't wait. The tour sells out very, very quickly. It departs Paris on the 30th of August, 2025, and you can find full information at our website, which is battlefields.com.au.
The new Boost Mobile network is offering unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for life.
That sounds like a threat.
Then how do you think we should say it?
Unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for the rest of your life?
I don't know.
Until your ultimate demise.
What if we just say forever?
Okay.
$25 a month, forever.
Get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile forever.
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Weight loss. It needs to be fast and sustainable. Noom GLP-1 starts at just $149 and ships to your door in 7 days. Take it from Lauren, who lost 22 pounds on Noom.
If I come off of the GLP-1, it's not going to automatically make my weight yo-yo back.
$149 GLP-1s? Now that's Noom smart. Get started at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. Individual results may vary. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Living History. We've had some great topics recently. World War I, World War II, we've had a good Vietnam episode that we've done recently, but I've really been looking forward to this one and trying to organise it for quite a while because it's a chapter of World War II that I'm going to confess at the outset I don't know enough about. We're talking about the Burma campaign and Australia's involvement in it, and I think it's a real black hole in our knowledge of our World War II involvement. And I've spoken to a lot of historians who are very passionate about this chapter and passionate about making sure we all understand what contributions and sacrifices were made. So I've really been looking forward to doing this for a while. I'm absolutely no expert on the Burma campaign, so I thought I'd get on someone who is. It's Daryl Moran. Daryl, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Great pleasure, Matt. Thank you very much indeed for having me. And I must confess I knew very little about this campaign until we started writing the books 3 or 4 years ago, Dr. Andrew Kilsby and I. And we've just uncovered this treasure trove of material about Australia's involvement, which I believe has been very well forgotten by modern generations. Although at the time, reading the newspaper reports, it was well known, but it has just been forgotten, overshadowed by Kokoda and all the other things that Australians did in the war. But I think I'm looking forward to being able to talk a little bit about it today.
Well, I think that's fantastic, and it's one thing we like to do is the story of history is an evolving conversation, and if we can shed some light on a chapter that's been overlooked, then I think we have an obligation to do that. Why don't we start though? Let's start from a position of absolute ignorance, which is where I'm coming from. That's not quite true. I do know about the Burma campaign, its overview, but why don't you just give us the story as it relates to the war, why there was even fighting in Burma?
Okay, well, we need to remember that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they attacked Malaya, and they moved very, very quickly through Thailand. There's hint that the Thai government collaborated, worked with them, etc. But suddenly, at the very end of 1941, very early 42, they're knocking on the door of Burma. So the British troops that were there were very, very minor. Burma had its own air force of 12 Tiger Moth aeroplanes, including an Australian who was a pilot, an RAAF member, but that's by the by. So the British were very concerned indeed because, of course, if Burma falls, then India, the jewel in the British Empire crown, is well and truly open for conquest. And the British are extremely underprepared indeed. The aircraft that they have are just not up to the task in any way, shape or form. The troops fight valiantly, but they're instantly pushed back. The Japanese forces are just overwhelming in all sorts of ways. And Burma quickly falls. But in that, there are Australians who are caught up in the fighting. So the way that Australians were there in the first instance was through the RAF. We need to remember that a huge number of Australians have been caught up in the Empire Air Training Scheme. They'd gone to England to train, and suddenly, by 1942-ish, they were being allocated to forces. Of course, Great Britain and the Channel and French and campaign, all those soaked up quite a few, but quite a number ended up in the Royal Air Force fighting in the Burma campaign from day one. Again, a little known fact, and it was an Australian who flew the last plane out of Rangoon as the Japanese were coming into the city a little further on. So we have a situation then in early 1942 where the very first Australian casualties are starting to occur. These are occurring from squadrons that were brought from the Middle East to try and shore up the very, very limited air capacity that existed there at that time. But would you believe before that there were Australian Army forces in the Burma theatre? So in July 1941, and note that date, July 1941, Australian were taken out of the Middle East. They volunteered for action as commandos. They joined up with British SOE forces. They trained in the highlands in Burma, and their task was to travel to China and to help train Chiang Kai-shek's forces, which they did. They were part of Tulip Force, and they had mixed fortunes because the Chinese at that stage seemed to be more interested in getting weapons and ammunition and lots of freebies rather than fighting the good fight. So tragically, many of the Tulip Force were evacuated out over the Himalayas, but some were left behind, 3 or 4 left behind, 2 killed in combat against Japanese, one who was captured. So by early 1942, we have a situation where the British have been well and truly kicked out of Burma. They're back into India. Japan reigns supreme. So we have Australians who are in the theatre in the Air Force and in the Navy. And so we could perhaps use that as a bit of a starting point because we need to consider that this whole theatre encompasses Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and I'll call it Ceylon from now on if I may, India, of course, which came under attack later in the war, Burma itself, and then China, which becomes, particularly Western China abutting Burma, becomes that enormous theatre of war. And it should be pointed out that for the British, there is no longer campaign in World War II than the Burma campaign, except for the operations in the Atlantic.
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Because it goes on for the entire war we're talking here. We're not talking about, 6 months of fighting. This campaign carried on in various phases right up until the end of the war, didn't it?
Very much so, right up until the bitter end in late August and early September 1945. And, of course, many of the Air Force were still there helping evacuate POWs. Sorry.
No, go on, Daryl.
So our research showed that once the war got really underway and the British were looking to get back in again, many other Australians were involved. So I've already talked about those commandos that were there. The Air Force, of course, and I want to come back and talk about them, but the Royal Australian Navy was involved as part of British fleets in helping to patrol that part of the world. We know that Ceylon was attacked twice by the Japanese fleet, and Australians again were killed. The Air Force were killed in those two attacks. There were actually Australian troops on the ground who were part of the Defence Force should the Japanese have decided to land, which they really had no intention of doing. Their task was really to try and destroy the British Air Forces. But the Navy was on patrol in there, and of course, at the same time as Ceylon was being attacked, the large aircraft carrier, the British aircraft carrier, the Hermes, was sent out to try and counteract along in company with the Vampire. The Hermes was attacked by planes from the Japanese fleet and was sunk. The first time ever in history that planes from one aircraft carrier had sunk an enemy aircraft carrier. Quite significant. And a few minutes later, the Vampire also was sent to the bottom in 1942. Probably the year of worst losses for the Australian Navy in its entire history. Fortunately, most of the crew survived. So we've had soldiers there, we've had aircraft there, we've had Navy there as well. But supporting them started to come other support staff. So the first women started to appear in Ceylon, and they were called VADs, the Voluntary Aid Detachments, and they were sent from under the auspices of the Red Cross. And they were there when the attacks happened on Ceylon. There were also the Comforts funders had a large part there, and of course there were hospitals that were staffed by Australians right through almost to the end of the war by Australian women.
It's an extraordinary story, Daryl. It's extraordinary we don't know more about it. I think we think of Burma in terms of prisoners. We know a bit about the story. For a long time it was referred to as the Burma Railroad, the Burma Railway, and since then we've sort of recalibrated a little bit and focused on Thailand as well, where I think, obviously some of the worst atrocities on the railway occurred probably in the Thai sector. So I think we know a bit about Burma because of the prisoners, but I think a lot of our listeners will be amazed to hear how much fighting was going on in Burma throughout the war and the extent of the Australian involvement.
Well, I think, again, we need to keep in mind that there were Australian prisoners of the Japanese, but they were not on the Burma-Thai Railway. These were aircrew who fell out of the sky for one reason or another or crashed the plane and survived. There were 16 Australians who were held as POWs in the Rangoon jail for the entirety of the war from 1943 onwards. One was killed tragically in an Allied air raid on Rangoon. They underwent all sorts of privations. Now, we're not trying to equate, being in jail on Changi or the Burma-Thai Railway with being in jail in Rangoon. The privations were still the same. The treatment was still horrendous and horrific. The main punishment for the aircrew was solitary confinement. And some of the Australians spent a year or more in the jail before knowing there were other Australians only a few cell blocks away. It was quite an incredible experience. I might move, while I'm talking on prisoners, right ahead to the very end of the war. So the very end of the war, because it's relevant to hearing about prisoners. This is a remarkable story. So towards on Anzac Day in 1945, the Japanese guards round up as many of the fit prisoners as they can. There were British, there were Indians, there were Canadians, there were Americans, there were Australians, and they march a party of about 300 of them out of the prison camp because they say, we're taking you to safety. Not really the case. In a long story short, there was quite a number of Australians who were left behind, including Wing Commander Bill Hudson. Now, he becomes the senior officer in the prison camp. But it transpires he's now the senior Allied person in all of Rangoon. The British forces haven't arrived at this stage, so for about 5 or 6 days, he is the de facto governor of Rangoon. The first thing he does is lock the prison down to keep the prisoners safe, because although the Japanese have gone, there are bands of marauders going right through Rangoon, looting and pillaging. Unbelievably, he negotiates with the Indian National Army. Now, the Indian National Army were Indian soldiers who had defected to the Japanese during the war and were fighting on the Japanese side. There's about 1,000 of them in Rangoon. And the Burma National Army, led by Aung San Suu Kyi's father, Aung San, there's about 500 of them. So Hudson collects all of the leaders at the Rangoon jail. This is remarkable. And he taps his wing commander's epaulets and he says, before you people go rampaging through, I want you to know I represent Lord Louis Mountbatten himself. And there'll be hell to pay if when the Allies arrive, if my people are not safe. Unbelievably, they go along with it and they go away. And in fact, they give Hudson and the prisoners arms and ammunition to defend themselves from marauders and bandits. Eventually the Allies arrive and the prisoners liberated. But for about 5 or 6 days, Hudson, this Australian, as I say, ruled the entire roost. I guess another angle to the prisoners on the Thai-Burma Railway is that many of their fellow Australians were flying the bombers that were bombing the Thai-Burma Railway because, of course, it was important to the British that the railway was destroyed because otherwise it would have brought Japanese supplies up. The Japanese were moving the prisoners on the railway closer and closer to the railway to try and avoid the bombing. So, we don't really know, but we know that the Australians in the planes could see the prisoners below when some bombs were going down, but such is war. I should imagine both groups of men on the ground and in the air had jobs to do, like it or not.
This cold and flu season, Instacart is here to help deliver all of your sick day essentials. Whether you're in prevention mode and need vitamins, hand sanitizer, and that lemon tea your Nana swears by, or you're in healing mode and need medicine, soup, and a lot more tissues. Simply download the Instacart app and get sick day supplies that reinvigorate or relieve, delivered in as fast as 30 minutes. Plus, enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 orders. Excludes restaurant orders, service fees, and terms apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Daryl, how many Australians are we talking about across all of these disparate groups? You've mentioned several of those groups already, but how many Australians are in this campaign during the course of the war?
Well, we're probably talking 2,000 to 3,000. We're talking.
It's a significant number. This is not, this is not a garrison of 20 blokes on some remote Pacific island. This is a substantial contribution to the war.
No, absolutely. By the time you take in the Navy who were there, by the time you've got those commandos, small force, we think about 1,700 Australians were flying with the RAF. Records are a little tricky. You would know from some of your research that sometimes Australians are marked as colonials rather than Australians. But we're very confident in the nominal roll that we've compiled, that we've got the 1,700-ish names. So as you say, about 3,000 or so were there. And again, very little recognition. When we launched the book at the Shrine, Professor Peter Stanley pointed out quite tartly, as Peter can, that on the Shrine at Melbourne, there's mention of all the campaigns of World War II, but not Burma. Not Burma. And in fact, it was only in the late 60s, early 70s, that the men and women who'd served in Burma managed to get the name Burma inscribed at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra.
It's extraordinary, Daryl, to think if we've got 2,000 or 3,000 service people in theatre during the course of the war, that means today there's tens of thousands of relatives and family members who would have grown up hearing these stories. How is it that this really important story has fallen through the cracks of history?
I think that the story of Kokoda and the story of the New Guinea campaigns, quite rightly, looms very, very large indeed, because they were just Australians in that sense. When you look at the Middle East and you look, for example, at the campaigns, Battle of Britain, etc., again, specific Australian squadrons when we're talking about Air Force. But the British didn't permit Australian squadrons in the Burma theatre. The Canadians managed to get their own squadrons, but not the Australians. Was that because Churchill was grumpy because Australia didn't send the various divisions to Burma on the way home and called them home for the defence of Australia? Who really knows? But the RAAF liaison office in Delhi worked for the entirety of their time in the war trying to get Australian squadrons, trying to group them together under the RAAF logo. So I think that's part of the reason, because we know when these people came back, come Anzac Day, they had no one to march with. Their squadrons were a British squadron. They had nowhere to go. But in Perth and in New South Wales, they formed what was called SEAC, the Southeast Asia Command group, and they actually had a special banner, one still in the Western Australian Air Force Museum, and they marched behind that. In fact, they got special permission from Lord Mountbatten himself, a written letter to say that, yes, that's what they were able to do. But generally, it's been forgotten. We know from some of the children of these service people, for example, some of them in the Air Force, who, whilst they were fighting in Burma, received letters from Australia with white feathers saying, "You are cowards, because what are you doing in Burma? Who cares when you should be here defending us from the Japanese who are about to invade Australia?" So people were pretty, they were pretty upset about it. We know that we've met with children who are no longer children, grandparents in most cases, who've got enormous treasure troves of artefacts and materials, written stuff, logbooks, etc., but nowhere to go because it hasn't ever been recognised as, I guess, a serious campaign. I haven't been to the Australian War Memorial in 18 months or so, but before all the renovations started, there was one small panel that noted the Australian service in Burma, one, and that was it. When you think that we had 350 Australians killed serving just in the Air Force alone, it really doesn't say much about, I guess, how we value the service of our people.
Well, let's try to shine a bit of a light on it now. Tell us, let's focus on the Air Force. Tell us what a typical mission for the Air Force in Burma looked like as far as the Australians were concerned.
Well, we know that Australians were present in every single type of squadron, from air-sea rescue to heavy bombers to fighters to reconnaissance to actually serving on the ground. So the Battle of Kohima and Imphal become critical to the Japanese thrust as they're trying to move through to take India to move into Assam up on that north-east frontier. But it's transport aircraft that revolutionised and changed the face of battle, because Field Marshal Slim realised that if you just held on, the Japanese would run out of supplies because they only brought enough for 9 days. And if you could outlast them, then you could beat them. So by having Dakota aircraft land or drop supplies, they were able to do it. Many Australians were in the forefront of those Dakota missions, either as kickers, getting the stuff out, or spotters on the ground, or actual pilots themselves. It wasn't just the shooting that was going on. Many of them were involved in the windgate operation, so oared windgates, chindits behind the lines operations, which revolutionised, if you like, guerrilla warfare, had to be supplied, and they were supplied from the air. But it was Australians who were the liaison officers on the ground who walked in the hundreds and hundreds of kilometres through the jungle with their radios, who called down supplies, pinpoint accuracy. And when the second Chindit operation went in, it was an Australian, Harry Hillgrave, who mastered and commanded for over 24 hours the landing strips as the gliders full of troops and the parachutes of supplies came down. So again, I've talked about air-sea rescue. I've talked about medivacs, tiny planes called Sentinels. So think Piper Cub, tiny Piper Cessna, very short takeoff and short runway required. They were landing behind the lines, again, piloted by Australians. We've got a number of records from at least 10 or 12 of them who were taken off fighter duties and put into these to land behind the lines to bring out wounded soldiers one at a time, brought them back, saved many hundreds of lives by doing that. Bomber missions, again, as well, you need to keep in mind that, the defence of Britain was the number one priority for equipment. Middle East, when that was happening, was second priority. Somewhere further down the track was the Burma campaign, dealing with third-rate equipment, third-rate supplies, third-rate just about everything. So a number of the bombers, for example, that were used late into the war had really been well and truly superseded much earlier in the war. So again, we need to keep in mind the conditions. So the jungles of Burma were some of the worst in the world. Fighter pilots, for example, described someone flying next to them being shot by anti-aircraft flyer, going into the jungle and the plane just disappearing. No smoke, no nothing, never to be seen again. Never to be seen again. The jungle just, one describes, I watched the plane go in, I circled, there was no trace, the jungle had just swallowed him up. Quite an incredible thing. So very different. There weren't the mass bomber raids that were going on in Europe, 1,000 bomber raids on German targets. There might have been 15, 20 planes because the targets were not as large if you're trying to bomb Japanese installations. But the flights were incredibly long. Some of the flights went for 24 hours because you had to fly from India or from Burma to attack a target deep in Thailand or Malaya, or later in the war, even Singapore, turning around, coming back, or the Andaman Islands, again, that were being attacked. So the fighter pilots, maybe with their tug in their cheek, were pretty grumpy about the bomber pilots who could get their tours and their hours up much quicker than the fighter pilots who only had short flights, whereas the bomber pilots, some of them were there for 24 hours as far as the turnaround was concerned. I think, again, we need to, understand that Australians were represented in every single aspect of air fighting in the campaign, including testing aircraft. One of the top, test pilots was an Australian who flew hundreds and hundreds of hours testing every single type of aircraft before it flew into combat. And we had the conditions that you had to deal with. So the very famous Mosquito aircraft, of course, that did so well in the European campaign, was brought out to fight in the Burma campaign. And that was all nice and fine until wings started falling off and bits of the plane fell off in flight. And a number of top Australian pilots were killed when that happened. The boffins in England refused to believe that this was the case and put it down to faulty flying. Some engineers flew out, took a test flight in the Hurricane and in the Mosquito, and the wings fell off. It flew into the ground. So de Havilland quickly got on the job, and they discovered that in the Burma campaign, what was happening was the camouflage paint was allowing the sun's UV rays to get in to the joints of the wooden airplane, and it was destroying the glue. So in this campaign in Burma, the problem was solved by painting these aeroplanes silver. So you can imagine a silver aeroplane silhouetted against the green of the jungle. The Allied pilots were none too happy about the target that they now offered to Japanese planes in this Wonder Mosquito. But it wasn't just the conditions, it was the weather. More casualties happened as a result of the atrocious weather conditions than from enemy combat. There's a story of 16, 17 Spitfires being flown from Burma across to India with one of the Australia's, again, top squadron commanders, McNamara, DFC, Bar, the whole thing. 16 of them fly across, they encounter a monsoon, and in the monsoon, you completely lost control of the aeroplane completely. 6 of the Spitfires went into the ground. 3 of them were Australians. And pilots in huge Liberator bombers describe what it was like to be caught in the monsoon weather, because Mountbatten decided the way to get an advantage was to fly in the monsoon weather. The Japanese retreated to Thailand and didn't fly. The monsoon went from March to November. So there was this whole period when the Japanese just said, no, we're sensible. The British said, come on, this is our chance. So pilots and crew of the Liberator, which was a 10-crew plane, described the wings wobbling in the air and flown upside down, sideways, upwards, dropping 1,000 feet without any control whatsoever, because the weather conditions were so incredibly harsh.
Weight loss. It needs to be fast and sustainable. Noom GLP-1 starts at just $149 and ships to your door in 7 days. Take it from Lauren, who lost 22 pounds on Noom.
If I come off of the GLP-1, it's not going to automatically make my weight yo-yo back.
$149 GLP-1s? Now that's Noom smart. Get started at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. Individual results may vary. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
It's extraordinary stuff. These are sacrifice and commitment and all those words we use to describe military service, but they're all coming to the fore here. It's quite extraordinary that we don't know more about it. Daryl, did you meet veterans of the campaign in your research, in your time?
So, sadly, most of them are well and truly no longer with us. Andrew came across one Liberator pilot who lived down at Werribee, but he's since passed away. But again, we've had great contact with a number of families who've been able to provide us with prime sources and all sorts of material. We've researched through the records of the Burma Star Association in Australia, and sadly no members left now. But the Australian War Memorial and the National Archives are a treasure trove of material. For example, when the prisoners were released from the Rangoon jail, they gave statements, 16 or 17, 20-page statements. The interrogators were really looking for war crimes from the Japanese. That's really what they were after. And we know that much of this material is sat in the archives and never been touched because there's never been really any reason to do so. So it would have been great to have done this work 10, 20 years ago, where we could have got many first-hand accounts, but sadly that was not to be.
Well, better late than never, and it's great that the story's being told now. Someone that you and I both know well, a great UK historian, Robert Lyman, has done an awful lot of work on the Burma campaign, and it's his absolute passion.
Yes.
He spent quite a bit of time leading tours and walking the ground as well. Have you been to Burma? Have you stood in the footsteps of the Anzacs on these sites?
No, I had not. We have Robert Lyman very kindly wrote the foreword to our book and provided all sorts of advice for us along the way. And we had the opportunity, I guess, to say where the Anzacs were. It's a bit tricky in some ways as to where they actually were, because they were Air Force. We know they were in Ceylon. There are many graves around. But as to an actual battle, it's a little bit harder to pin down. It's not like Gallipoli. You're on the beach, you're up this spur, there spur, or the Western Front. But no, I have not been there. Our advice has been that it can be a little tricky to go to some of the places that we want to go to. So if we were to go to, say, central Burma, or places where there are Commonwealth war graves, it's a little tricky at the moment, unfortunately. We'd love to.
Maybe one day I'll join you on that trip. It sounds amazing. Talks about your books, because it's not just one book. There's several books you've dedicated to the Aussies in the campaign. So tell us about those and the stories that they tell.
The second book
I can see one of them on the shelf behind you, In the Fight.
Yes, you can. So
I've mentioned in conjunction with Carl James from the Australian War Memorial. We've discussed that with him before, but tell us a bit more about these publications.
Well, thank you. In the Fight, first of all, I guess was the second book. We started writing a book we've called Resolute, which deals just with the experience of the RAAF during 1942 to 46 in the Burma campaign. Again, a forgotten story. It gets 2 chapters in the official history written in the early 50s, and that's about it. So we've been able to uncover a great deal of material about their experience. And for the first time, we've put together a nominal roll of everyone who served with their service numbers, and we've put together a nominal roll of those who died, again, which has never been done. So we're particularly pleased. We're looking for Big Sky to publish this later in the year. Hopefully it should be out in October. Again, the more we researched, the more we found. I've told you some of these stories. We were surprised to find Australians flying into China. Now, we don't really think of that. We think, okay, maybe in the Korean War, although, you weren't crossing that Yalu River, were you? But be that as it may, we know that Australians were involved in supplying Chiang Kai-shek's army. The Americans were in Burma for one reason only, and that was to keep Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese army, nationalist army, fighting. Because if they didn't, the Japanese troops would have been diverted further into the Pacific campaign. The British were there ostensibly for that reason, but probably mainly to restore their empire. And the Americans were a little cranky about that because they didn't want that to happen. But we know, for example, that Australians were flying what was called the hump. So the Burma Road was well and truly cut. That wasn't able to be used because the Japanese had captured that. So there were aeroplanes flying from Assam in northern India to Kunming in China, but you have to go across the Himalayas to do that. So it was called the hump. Flying, in typical, airmen downplaying the dangers, they were flying across the hump. Now, there were no charts, very little in the way of weather prediction, and an incredibly dangerous place to fly because, again, of this unbelievable weather that occurs up in that area. But they were flying supplies in and out. We know that at least 600 planes were lost during the war, British and Americans doing this. And in fact, after a while, it became easy to find your way for pilots because they followed what they called the aluminium trail, which was the wreckage of all the planes along the way that sparkled in the sunlight. So flying all sorts of cargoes in. Sometimes they might be flying diplomats. Sometimes they might be flying spies, troops, etc. We know that there was an Australian who became Chiang Kai-shek's personal pilot and flew him around, as well as Madam Chiang Kai-shek as well during that period of time. But again, flying in supplies, was not without its risks. At the Battle of Cohiba at Imphal, we learnt that to supply some of the Indian troops, because they needed their food killed in the halal way, the only way you could do that was to parachute live goats from the Dakotas, which is what they did. They also needed transport and animal power to pull weapons, so they had to fly in mules as well. And there are a number of stories of mules who just were the classic stubborn as, including one that got loose and started to run around the cargo bay of a Dakota aeroplane until the co-pilot pulled out his pistol and shot it dead in midair because they risked going into the ground. So again, I talk about Australians being involved in that wide range of activities. This book has tried to tell not just their story, but the story of Australian correspondents who were there. So Australia had quite a team of war correspondents, including people such as Frank McClure, who became a famous author later on, and Wilfred Burchett. Now, Wilfred Burchett, in later wars, was not viewed too well, particularly in the Vietnam War when he appeared to side with North Vietnam and Communist China. But he was certainly a man on the ground. He wrote 3 or 4 books about the Burma campaign, and the Australians were seen, all the Australian journalists who were there, were seen as the journalists to trust because they actually went to the front, whereas a lot of the other nationalities sat back in the officers' club enjoying some liquid from Scotland and relying on the Army or the Air Force releases to get their stories out. We've talked about commandos, we've talked about nurses. There were also artists. The Australian War Memorial was very keen to ensure that, as in World War I, that the record of Australia in the field was recorded. And so a number of key Australian artists were sent there, including a bloke called William Dargie. So Dargie, of course, had been an Australian soldier, but was also later to become Australia's top portrait painter. He won the Archibald Prize 8 times. And the first one he won, he was digging a trench in Tobruk when he was informed by a telegram that he'd won the Archibald Prize. But he travelled Burma and painted a number of portraits. And again, the Australian War Memorial oversaw that. The staff at the War Memorial who wrote this chapter uncovered over 100 pieces of artwork that were done by these artists that really hadn't seen the light of day at all since World War II. And you're thinking about the calibre of an artist like Dargie, you want to ensure that it was out on display. Qantas plays an unknown part as well. Although they weren't involved in the shooting and the fighting, they provided an absolutely vital war service because Qantas Catalinas set up a service in early 1943 to fly from Western Australia to Ceylon non-stop. So that's well over 3,000 nautical miles that they were travelling in 24, 25-hour flights. Now, during the war, they did not lose one plane to enemy action. Not one of these Catalinas was ever intercepted or shot down or crashed. A remarkable record. But again, Qantas ensured that the passengers who were there, they called them the double sunrise flights because by the time you went from Perth to Ceylon, you'd seen 2 sunrises. There were many diplomats who flew. It was used to fly military dispatches, diplomatic pouches, etc. as well. Again, quite a remarkable achievement. Again, absolutely unknown, but vital to the war effort in providing that particular link. We know too of the sportsmen. There were Australian sportsmen. There was a lot of cricket happening between the RAF and the RAAF teams. And in the closing months of the war, there was a test team, if I can use that, who toured as well with Keith Miller. If you know anything about Keith Miller, you know he was having a wonderful time, thank you very much, in India. But the Australian government saw that this was a way of keeping up morale. And in fact, these were the first, if you like, test matches. It was really the birth of test cricket because the Indians won most of the matches and then came to Australia and toured. It was really the birth of Indian test cricket. I'm not sure how successful we want that to be, but there you go. It certainly was. I think one of the most remarkable stories is concerning a group of Australian women and British women who were known as Women's Auxiliary Service Burma, WASBs for short. So as the Japanese were invading Burma, there were a number of Australian women who were the wives of planters, or there were the daughters of business people, etc., who decided that this just wasn't good enough and that the fighting men needed some extra support. So some incredible women convinced the British government to give them trucks and supplies, and they acted as a mobile canteen behind the lines. And there were a number of Australian women who were doing this, and they were still being recruited in 1945 to go and serve these mobile canteens, crews of 5 or 6, tea, coffee, chocolate, small supplies, etc. But to see the women there, we know was an enormous morale boost to the men who were fighting on the ground. And when we were at the book launch last year, there were 3 women of later years, senior years, who turned up, and one of them was wearing medals. And we asked why, and she said, well, my mum had been a WASB, and we never really knew her story at all because she wouldn't talk about it until this book was written. And she'd been 101 and only recently passed away. So again, we've been able to unearth this incredible contribution, an unsung contribution. And a number of these women were also involved working with the SOE as code breakers and working in the area doing all sorts of administrative stuff behind the lines. Again, Australians unsung in that regard.
It's just extraordinary stuff, Daryl. We've got to wrap it up pretty soon, but just before we do, just answer the really important question about all this. Why is it important that we remember what went on in Burma?
I think it's important for a number of reasons. I think, first of all, we know from the writings of some of the Air Force men, for example, and we've got some access to some of their letters, they saw that in this enormous conflict that had engulfed the world, the largest conflict that the world had ever seen, they saw that they were playing their small part, and that by stopping the Japanese, which they did in Burma, it meant that the Japanese forces were tied up. They weren't able to go elsewhere and reinforce. So their small, seemingly small part was incredibly important in the mix of things. I think the part that all of these people played, the commandos, the WASBs, the artists, the sailors, it's not, as Robert Lyman said, it's not about the big battalions and huge moves on the Western Front. It's small pieces of a larger part playing their part. And, when all's said and done, these people were prepared to give their lives, if necessary, for the greater cause. Were they defending Australia? Well, yes, they were, because the Japanese, if they'd succeeded in invading India, for argument's sake, would have cut off supply lines. There would have been all sorts of issues. I think no matter what, these people deserve to be remembered. They were prepared to place their lives on the lines. 350 Australian airmen did lose their lives. Others as well lost their lives. There's no more important gift that you can give. And if we can't remember them, along with those who died at Gallipoli and those who died at Kokoda and those who died everywhere else, then it says little about us as a society and the value that we place upon the service and sacrifice of our service people.
I think that's very well said, Daryl. I couldn't agree more. If we're going to remember the Anzacs as a group of people, we have to know the whole story. We can't just pick and choose the bits that we find most exciting on Anzac Day. So it's been a real education for me. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed the reading the book. in the fight, which I'd recommend people go out and read because it does reveal a very important story. But I want to say on behalf of all the listeners, thank you. Thank you for the hard work. Thank you for bringing this story to light, you and the other historians who are attempting to bring the Burma campaign out of the shadows. So I appreciate the work you've been doing. I appreciate you coming on the show today to talk about it.
My great pleasure. Thanks again, Matt, for all your work, and thanks for having me on. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistorytv.com for more great history content. If you're planning a trip to Europe in 2025, you can walk in the footsteps of the Anzacs. Our Western Front Explorer Tour spends 4 days exploring all the Australian battlefields from the First World War in the Somme, the Ypres Salient and Flanders. This is the only Australian tour that begins and ends in Paris, so it's a really great way to see those famous battlefields. Now, the Western Front Explorer Tour departs weekly between April and November, and it includes accommodation in the heart of the battlefields, deluxe transportation, and a range of extras that you only get on a Matt McLachlan tour. And like all our tours, you'll be escorted by one of our expert historians who will bring the story of the Anzacs to life. This itinerary has been personally designed by me, and all the historians are my friends and colleagues, and I've handpicked them to lead these tours. This really is a brilliant way to see the battlefields. It's the 4-day Explorer Tour, departing weekly from Paris, and for more information, you can visit battlefields.com.au.